Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Anyekolu in Abuja. Let's return to one of our top stories, the latest on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Russia says it's strengthening its positions on the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea, of course, which had annexed from Ukraine in 2014. Meanwhile, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban calling EU sanctions against Russia a step towards war and describing the bloc's Russia policy as dangerous. Well, for more on all of that, let's speak to the Eastern European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskovic. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Laskovic. Let's start with what is going on in Crimea. Russia said to be fortifying its positions there. I wonder why it's doing that. I mean, what are you hearing?
As far as I can tell, it's just part of general preparations. The Russians tend to be very defensive-minded in this respect, and the fact they're fortifying, if you look over Russian history, they've always taken their fortifications seriously and been ready for attack. I don't think one should read too much into this. Rather more interesting is what they're planning to do, having mobilized, partially mobilized, what they're planning to do after this mobilization, because they've been kept very quiet. Disconcertingly so, really. So it'll be interesting to see what plans Putin has now, not in terms of defense, but in terms of further aggression, which is, I think, the key problem. So strengthening the defenses in Crimea, I don't think is a primary concern.
Well, let's talk about what you think is a primary concern, then, that what they're going to do with that mobilization. I mean, what do you reckon? Because a lot of what we're hearing suggests that a lot of those soldiers, people who've been mobilized and drafted in, are not really that well trained.
Oh, well, indeed. Just because you mobilize doesn't mean you have an army straight away. They have to be trained up. And of course, the fact they're keeping quiet is nothing more than they're preparing their plans and training up their troops. The question is what plan they propose. And as far as I can tell, again, based on more Russian history, winter is the period when they really like doing things. And therefore, it's going to be not immediately, but after a short time that we'll see just what plans he has in mind. So therefore, it is a period of training. In exactly the same way as the invasion on the 24th of February was not a spontaneous affair, but took months of preparation. Probably from September, in other words, after the August retreat from Afghanistan by the Americans, is when they started to draw up their plans. So it's nothing immediate. However, it is the one which is of greatest interest, just what he proposes to do.
And what about your assessment of Hungary and where it stands in all of this? Because, I mean, we're seeing increasingly strong rhetoric coming from the Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He's called EU sanctions against Russia a step towards war. He described the EU's Russia policy as dangerous. What do you make of all that?
Well, Orban is actually an admirer of Putin. So in this respect, he is part of the explanations for what he's saying is that he's providing support for President Putin and for Russia obviously a key part of the world, namely the EU. A second aspect of this is that, of course, he, like many people, is worried about the possibility of the conflict escalating, because were it to escalate, Hungary is very close to Russia, and goodness knows how it could all turn out. So therefore, there is this twin aspect about Orban's rhetoric, which, in top of everything else, it has to be realized that it shows yet again that President Putin is not without allies or supporters, or sympathizers, however you care to call them, and that therefore it's not going to be a simple matter of Russia being the sole rogue state, just all by itself. And we should bear in mind that Russia does have support elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I wonder to what extent that shows cracks within the EU bloc, especially when it comes to things like that, Viktor Orban was referring to, soaring energy bills and, very high inflation, which he's blaming on Brussels. I mean, I wonder because Poland, the country that you originally come from, is also a neighbor of Ukraine. I mean, I wonder what the feeling is about that sort of thing there.
Oh, well, Poland's got its long-running disputes with the EU. The EU is not paying them money. There's all sorts of things going on. Broadly speaking, the division in Western and Eastern Europe remains to this day. And the point about it is the East Europeans do not feel comfortable with many of the Brussels directives or how Brussels treats them. Amongst other things are issues such as liberal democracy, which in the West has gone very far, and in places like Hungary or Poland obviously has not. And if you read what President Orban has to say about LGBT and about other such issues, you'll realize that perhaps he's certainly not on board the EU liberal democracy bus. Another aspect of this is, of course, that as the problems rise financially, there's going to be a problem whether the EU can carry on funding Eastern Europe. Certainly, there's been a movement, not just by Germany, by Holland, the northern countries, to stop paying out money to the south and to the east, which is what it basically boils down to. And I anticipate that with the current economic crisis, which is of course very bad in England, but elsewhere also, these problems will be exacerbated. And this, in fact, feeds back on the war because there is no EU voice in this respect. You can only say that what Germany or France decide, broadly speaking, is the EU. But the other countries are certainly not on board in every respect. And I anticipate these problems, these differences will continue to actually grow and not disappear.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that assessment. Dr. Marek Laskovic is the Eastern European Affairs Analyst, and he was talking to me there from London.